October 15, 1941, Italian ace pilot Captain Marco Santini and his squadron were literally laughing at reconnaissance photos of the new American P-40 Warhawk, calling it a flying truck compared to their sleek, beautiful Machi fighters that had dominated North African skies for months. Within weeks, half his squadron was dead, shot down by the same aircraft they'd mocked, and Marco himself was staring at P-40 wreckage that had absorbed damage that would have obliterated his superior Italian fighter. But how could a plane they considered obsolete and crude completely destroy the confidence of pilots who thought they were flying the most advanced fighters in the world? The blazing sun hung like a copper coin over the Benghazi airfield in October 1941. Heat waves danced across the dusty runway where Italian fighter planes sat in perfect rows. The Machi C-200 fighters gleamed like silver arrows, their sleek bodies catching the desert light. These beautiful machines had ruled the North African skies for over a year. Captain Marco Santini wiped sweat from his forehead as he walked between the aircraft. At 28, he was already an ace pilot with 12 enemy planes shot down. His dark eyes showed the confidence of a man who had never lost a dogfight. The desert air smelled of oil, hot metal, and victory. Under a canvas tent, young Lieutenant Giuseppe Romano was telling jokes to the other pilots. Everyone called him Beppe. He was only 22 but flew like he was born in the cockpit. His Fiat G50 had bright yellow stripes painted on the nose. Beppe loved to brag about how Italian engineering was the best in the world. Squadron Commander Alessandro Toretti sat at a wooden table, reading reports and frowning. He was 45 and had been flying since the last war. His weathered hands showed the scars of many battles. The other pilots respected him because he never sent them anywhere he would not go himself. The mood changed when a jeep roared up to the tent. A messenger jumped out carrying a thick envelope marked with red stamps. Toretti tore it open and pulled out several black and white photographs. His frown grew deeper as he studied each picture. "Gather around," Toretti called to his men. The pilots crowded around the table, still joking and laughing. The photos showed a new American fighter plane called the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. The aircraft looked nothing like their graceful Italian fighters. Beppe burst out laughing first. "Look at that ugly thing. It looks like someone stuck wings on a truck." The other pilots joined in, pointing at the P-40's thick, bulky nose and heavy-looking body. Marco shook his head and grinned. The American plane seemed slow and clumsy compared to their fast, nimble fighters. "The engine cowling is huge," another pilot said. "It must be so heavy it can barely get off the ground." More laughter filled the tent. Someone made airplane sounds while pretending to crash. The idea that this crude-looking machine could threaten their beautiful Italian fighters seemed like a joke. But Toretti did not laugh. He had been reading intelligence reports about American factories. The numbers worried him. Still, looking at these photos, even he found it hard to believe this ungainly aircraft could match their proven fighters. The P-40 looked like it belonged in a museum, not in combat against the finest pilots in the Mediterranean. The desert wind picked up, sending sand swirling around the airfield. In the distance, heat mirages made the horizon shimmer and dance, creating illusions that seemed real until you looked closer. None of the laughing pilots noticed how the mirages matched their own distorted view of what was coming their way. 3 weeks later, the laughter stopped. Marco's radio crackled to life as he climbed into the morning sky. "Bandits approaching from the east," the voice warned. "Unknown aircraft type." Marco squinted through his cockpit glass and saw them coming. 6 P-40 Warhawks flying in tight formation, their shark-tooth-painted noses grinning like hungry predators. Bepe's voice came through the radio, excited and confident. Finally, time to show these Americans how real pilots fight. The Italian squadron split apart, ready to use their favorite turning moves. Their Machi and Fiat fighters could spin and dance in the air better than any plane in the world. But the P-40s did something strange. Instead of turning to fight, they dove down from high above like falling rocks. Marco watched in shock as 6 streams of orange fire erupted from the lead American fighter. The sound was like thunder tearing through cloth. 50 caliber bullets ripped through the air where Bepe's yellow-striped Fiat had been flying just seconds before. Bepe's plane came apart like a broken toy. Pieces of metal and fabric scattered across the sky. The young pilot's radio went silent forever. Marco felt ice in his stomach as he watched his friend's fighter spiral down toward the sand below. The American planes did not stay to dogfight. They climbed back up into the sun, their powerful engines roaring. Marco tried to follow, but his Machi felt slow and weak. The P-40s disappeared into the bright sky, leaving the Italian pilots stunned and angry. 2 days later, Marco walked through the wreckage of a P-40 that had been shot down near the base. British ground fire had finally brought one down, but what Marco saw made his hands shake. The American fighter had 27 bullet holes in its wings and body, 27 holes that would have turned his beautiful Machi into burning scrap. The P-40's armor plating was thick as his thumb. Marco ran his fingers over the heavy metal sheets that protected the pilot's seat. His own fighter had no armor at all. The fuel tanks were covered in rubber that sealed up when bullets passed through. Italian fighters had no such protection. One lucky shot could turn them into flying torches. Inside the cockpit, Marco found something that made him feel sick. The American pilot's seat was like a metal cave surrounded by steel plates. The instrument panel was simple but strong. Everything was built to take damage and keep flying. Italian fighters were built to be fast and graceful, like racehorses. But racehorses died easily when wolves came hunting. That night, Marco lay on his cot staring at the tent ceiling. He could still hear the sound of those 6 50 caliber guns firing all at once. It was like the difference between throwing pebbles and dropping boulders. The beautiful Italian fighters suddenly felt as fragile as glass birds in a world full of hammers. The desert sun was setting when Marco's engine coughed and died. His damaged Machi glided down toward the sand like a wounded bird. British soldiers found him an hour later, dazed but alive. Within days, he was sitting behind barbed wire in a prison camp near Cairo, watching American mechanics work on broken P-40s. What Marco saw made his world crumble piece by piece. An American sergeant threw away a perfectly good propeller blade because it had a small dent. In Italy, that same blade would have been hammered straight and used again. The Americans tossed aside engine parts like they were old newspapers. Metal that would be precious in Italy was garbage to them. Marco watched a young American mechanic pour motor oil from a 50-gallon drum. The boy spilled more oil in 5 minutes than Marco's entire squadron used in a week. When Marco asked why, the mechanic shrugged. "We got plenty more where that came from," he said, pointing to 20 more barrels stacked nearby. The captured Italian pilot learned to speak with the American ground crews during his long days in camp. One mechanic from Detroit told him something that made Marco's stomach drop. "These P-40s, they're old junk back home. We're already building much better fighters. The factories pump out over 1,000 planes every month. 1,000 planes. Marco's entire Air Force had fewer than that. A shot-down American pilot shared Marco's tent. His name was Bill, and he came from a small town in Ohio. Bill mentioned that his hometown had 3 factories. One made airplane engines, another made aluminum sheets, and the third made machine guns. "Just in my little town," Bill said casually, "we probably make more airplane parts in a month than your whole country makes in a year." Marco lay awake that night, doing math in his head. If one small American town could outproduce all of Italy, what about their big cities? What about Detroit, where they made thousands of cars? What about the steel mills he had heard about? The numbers made his head spin with fear. The truth hit him like a hammer blow. The P-40 was not crude because Americans were bad at building planes. It was heavy and strong because they could afford to make it that way. They had so much aluminum, so much steel, so much oil that they could build fighters like tanks. Italian fighters were beautiful and light because Italy had to squeeze every ounce of metal, every drop of fuel. Marco realized they had been lions fighting house cats for so long they forgot what real lions looked like. But America was not just a lion. It was a whole pride of lions, and Italy had been a house cat pretending to be fierce. The laughter in that desert tent now seemed like the sound of children whistling past a graveyard, trying to convince themselves they were not afraid of ghosts that turned out to be very real. Marco stepped off the train in Milan on a cold morning in March 1946. The war had been over for 10 months, but the city still looked like a broken tooth. Bomb craters filled with dirty water dotted the streets. Buildings stood like empty skeletons, their walls blown away by the same American bombers whose fighters had taught him such hard lessons in the desert. His wife Maria ran to him at the station, tears streaming down her thin face. She felt lighter in his arms than he remembered. Everyone in Italy had grown thinner during the long war years. The bread was still rationed, and real coffee was just a memory. Marco pulled a small piece of aluminum from his coat pocket. It was a fragment from that crashed P-40 he had examined so long ago. He had carried it through 2 years of prison camp as a reminder. Walking through his old neighborhood, Marco saw the ruins of the Caproni aircraft factory where his brother had worked. Allied bombs had flattened the buildings in 1943. Weeds now grew through the twisted metal and broken concrete. The factory that once built Italy's finest fighters was now just a field of rubble and scrap iron. His 8-year-old son, Giuseppe, ran up to greet him. The boy had been born just before Marco left for Africa. "Papa, did you really fly in the war? Did you shoot down lots of enemy planes?" The child's eyes sparkled with excitement, the same look Marco had once seen in his own mirror. Marco knelt down and showed his son the piece of P-40 aluminum. It was still smooth and strong after all these years, not even rusty. "This came from an American fighter plane," he said quietly. "We used to laugh at these planes because they looked big and clumsy next to our beautiful Italian fighters." Giuseppe touched the metal with wonder. "Did you beat them, Papa?" Marco looked at his son's hopeful face and struggled to find the right words. How could he explain that they had been playing a game they could never win? How could he tell a child that sometimes the turtle really does beat the rabbit? "Son, we thought we were artists making beautiful sculptures. The Americans were workers making tools that did the job." Marco pointed to the factory ruins. "We made fighters that looked like jewelry. They made fighters that worked like hammers. In the end, the hammer always beats the sculpture, no matter how pretty the sculpture might be." Years later, when Giuseppe became an engineer, he would remember his father's words about function over beauty, about building things that worked instead of things that just looked good. Marco's dessert lesson had traveled home in a small piece of aluminum, carrying with it the understanding that real strength comes from having enough of everything, not from making do with too little while pretending it was a choice.